Mark Ellison wasn't a man who ever questioned his own brilliance. He couldn't afford to. At MIT, he was a rising star, a theoretical physicist on the verge of something big. But even among the brightest minds in science, Mark stood out. His IQ was so high, the tests stopped working on him after a while, like trying to measure the depth of a bottomless well. He had been called a prodigy, the next Einstein, a title that was as meaningless to him as any other label. The real truth was simpler, darker. Mark had been chasing an idea since he was a child, a question that kept him awake at night, gnawing at his mind until it consumed everything else. Are we living in a simulation? He'd thought about it all. The theory of relativity, black holes, the Big Bang. He had seen them all laid out in neat equations, beautiful and terrifying in their precision. He could explain the vast, incomprehensible workings of the universe as if it were second nature. But there was something off about it all, a flaw, a missing piece. The universe had rules, sure, but they felt more like prison bars than the natural order. The more Mark thought about it, the more he was convinced that these rules were baked in by someone or something, that the universe wasn't a discovery, it was a construct. He was careful not to speak about it out loud, not to mention his obsession to the faculty. They'd never understand. They'd call it delusion, just like they'd done to others who dared to look too closely at the edges of the world. But Mark knew. He knew deep down that something was wrong, something fundamental. He wasn't sure what would happen when he found it, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't look away. It was late when Mark finally managed to corner the QX99, the university's newest quantum computer. Everyone had gone home for the night, and the building was empty except for the hum of the machines. He'd been preparing for this moment for months, gathering every scrap of information, every theory, every experiment that might prove his belief. He'd found the perfect test. The computer was the most advanced thing MIT had, a machine capable of calculating outcomes that stretched across multiple realities, some said. Mark didn't believe in parallel universes. No, for him, the answer was simpler than that. He just needed to push the system to the limit. If reality was a simulation, then there had to be a way to break it, to overload it. He couldn't explain why it had to be this way, only that it did. Theories about quantum computing and alternate dimensions weren't enough. He needed something more, something visceral. He typed in the program. He could feel the weight of the keys as his fingers hovered above them, a slow tremor running through his body. This was it. This was the moment he had waited for. His finger hovered over the enter key, and for a second, he almost didn't press it. What if I'm wrong? The thought flickered, but it was too late. The question was out there. It had been since he was a kid, when he first watched the stars and wondered if they were just dots painted on the ceiling of a vast cosmic theatre. With a deep breath, he pressed the key. Immediately, the computer hummed louder. The air in the lab thickened, filled with a strange static energy. Mark felt it all around him, the sense of something not quite right. The screen blinked erratically, and then, for a split second, there was a sound. A grinding, whirring, electronic screech that wasn't supposed to come from a machine like this. It was like a cat's screech, too high-pitched, too unnatural. "Mark," someone yelled from the doorway, but he didn't turn. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on the screen. Numbers, endless strings of numbers, rushed across the screen, flickering and distorting in a way that defied any understanding. The hum grew louder, like a swarm of bees trapped in a jar, pushing against the very edges of reality. And then it happened. A crack, like the sound of glass breaking. Not a physical sound, but something deeper, something in the very structure of space and time itself. Mark's heart slammed in his chest. Before him, the air shimmered, warping like heat off a blacktop in the summer. And then, a rift, a tear in the fabric of the world. Mark stared, his mouth dry. He knew on some level that what he was witnessing wasn't just an error. It was proof that he'd been right all along. Behind the rift was not chaos, not some distant alien world, but something else. Something old, something vast. Energy spheres, glowing bright and sickly, hovered in the void behind the rift like the remnants of a dying star. Mark's mind recalled. It wasn't just alien, it was wrong. His stomach lurched, a cold sweat forming on his skin. He knew he should stop, but he couldn't. Not now. The rift began to close, slowly, like the seam of an old wound healing. The energy spheres flickered, dimming as the tear in reality stitched itself back together. Then, with one final shudder, the lab was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But Mark knew something had, and on his computer screen, a single line of text appeared. "Don't do this again. We will end the simulation. You will get your answers once you find the answer." The words were simple, but they were enough to send a cold shiver up Mark's spine. Mark shut down the computer, his hands shaking, his thoughts a blur. He stumbled out of the lab, hardly noticing the empty hallways as he made his way home. He didn't know what he had just seen, but the message, "We will end the simulation," it echoed in his mind. The question that had haunted him for years now sat in front of him like a living thing. What is the answer? At home, he sat in the dim light of his apartment, his eyes locked on the Super Nintendo console that sat on the shelf, gathering dust. His fingers brushed against the old controller, and for a moment he remembered something. As a child, he had played these games for hours. The limited worlds, the impossibly simple rules. It's all just a game, Mark thought. It's all just a game, and we're the players. He turned on the system, watching the old, pixelated graphics flicker to life. But something had changed. He knew, deep down, that there was no turning back now. The answers were out there, but at what cost? As the screen blinked before him, Mark whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "What's the answer?"